Hi all. So here we are coming to the end of our course and American Graffiti. Okay, so I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'm assuming most of you probably have seen it before. If not, you would have been in the minority, and that's one thing about this film that makes it worth looking at is just how powerfully it's resonated with billions of people. This film was made. You can easily find that out for under $1 million, 770 something thousand, and went on to make so far 140 million, and that's just the film itself. That's not the soundtrack, the album that was put out that all of us bought back in the 70s, and probably is still selling. In any case, so very immensely popular film, and really pivotal in launching George Lucas's career, and and a social film. It gives us the this American post-war era, the super interesting time, and very different than the films we've had in this course, obviously, which are largely, well, let's just say nobody's getting shot in this film, right? In any case, so a bit of a shift toward the cultural, and but there's some really great themes in here, some deeper ones that come out that I want to explore with you. Okay, so I really hope you enjoy the lecture, and I hope you enjoyed the film, and by extension the whole course. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to turn the camera off, just keep the file shorter as well, like I've been doing lately. Okay. Okay, so where we start, of course, is what's the central message, what's the thesis, and I'm interested in what your sense of George Lucas's message is, in as much as you can find one in American Graffiti. And so I give you the article by Godfrey, and it gets at where I want to start here, because he gets into that the film is often read as being simply nostalgia, right? And he reads it as being not merely nostalgic, that it's about the loneliness and directionlessness of teens in this era, this critical era before Vietnam, the Beatles, the end of the the coming of age film, right? And so more than that, though, that it's more than simply a coming of age. It's a real watershed and a turnaround point in American history. So in that way, the coming of age of these youth is really the coming of age of America. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into him, or that's what I'm taking, because that's really what I see. But he says the action is inaction, this directionless circling of Modesto by youth contained within this suburban American bubble, this town, which is also a more or less a cage, right? Uh, and picking up on that is this guy named Mark Decker. Mark Decker is not a historian. He's an English scholar. Teaches English at university in the United States, but in any case, he has done several books on and articles about Lucas's worldview and his films and themes in them. And he has this article, and there's a book by him not too long ago. In this article, it's actually a chapter in the book, and its subtitle is this: Lucas and the Persistence of Marcusian Social Critique in Star Wars and American Graffiti, which sounds pretty heavy. But what he does is well, first he identifies those critical readings of American Graffiti by critics who say it's conservative nostalgia, it doesn't challenge racial or gender norms, and it fetishizes technology. So commodity fetishism fetishizes technology, namely the vehicle, the amazing automobiles, and makes capitalism seem harmless, which is what fetishization of commodities does. And another critique of Lucas is that the film teaches traditional masculinity, and it reinforces and celebrates the myth of the nuclear family. And even there's a critique that says that he's saying that religion is the only way to win in a technological world. And I don't see that theme coming through very strongly. But these are all critiques leveled at Lucas. And he says no. He says no, they're just not getting it. And he says you have to know, you have to put this film in context and know that Lucas's earlier film was a fail, and it was panned for being this preachy critique of American society. It was a science fiction film called THX 1138. Didn't do well, and Lucas said, coming out of that, he said, quote, "I was considered a cold, weird director, and I decided to do something exactly the opposite." If they want warm human comedy, I'll give them one just to show them that I can do it. So this is what he said he was doing in this film. And he also said, and he told this to Sidney Pollack, he said, you have to come at things sideways. Okay, so what he's suggesting there, and this is what where Decker is saying, is that he learned that if you want to offer a credible critique of society, you have to do it in an entertaining way, make the subject enjoyable. Okay, so that is what Lucas thinks he is doing or says he is doing, and Decker takes him at his word. And how Decker links this to Marcuse, who, by the way, Herbert Marcuse is this eminent post-war Marxist philosopher. He's been called the father of the New Left, and he's classic neo-Marxist, in that he says, Marcuse says that people are passive consumers, right? Or programmed to be passive consumers. We're victims of corporate capitalism. And that's a very old Marxist line, right? And that really is about commodity fetishism. Like we're all, that Marx couldn't explain why conditions under capitalism, why the revolution never happens, and the way he explains it is because the working class, the masses have been satisfied, programmed through capitalism, through commodities, to be satisfied with their lot, kind of like birds in a gilded cage. Great image, right, of what Marx and neo-Marxists believe. Birds in a gilded cage. We get all these shiny things, so we don't launch any social critiques of this exploitation of capitalist society. Right, and the inherent problems in it, and of course this is the Adbusters approach. This is this is the left, right? This is the leftist critique of capitalism. So, in any case, how Decker links Lucas to Marcuse is about how Lucas is accused of fetishizing the automobile and, by extension, American capitalism. But Marcuse had said that one can appreciate the utility of a thing, the usefulness of a thing, while still critiquing the system it represents. And this is what Decker says Lucas is doing, that he is doing that. He's appreciating utility, and in some ways the amazing, the beauty, the aesthetic value of a time and era as represented mostly by the automobile, while critiquing the system it represents. And he says that the main character, Kurt, is key to understanding what Luke is saying. The main character, Kurt, or at least one of the two main protagonists. And why he says that is because Kurt is both inside and outside of his culture. And that's clear in the way he thinks, right? He's not all in. He's not local. He's not small town. He's wanting out. He's wanting more. And his status is symbolized in a world where everyone is judged by their vehicles. He's got this completely non-conforming vehicle choice. He's got a Citroën, and it was the kind of Citroën that was known as the ugly duckling in Europe. It was millions of these were produced in the post-war period, and little polluting French vehicle. The ugly duckling. So he's got a Citroën, which is completely nonconformist. And then you got the film ending and the post-script explanation of the characters, which is key to understanding the message of the film. And what happens to Kurt? Well, he flies into the sunrise, which is the future. He's escaped the cage, and his future is going to be also an escape, a rejection of America during the Vietnam War. And where does he end up? He ends up a writer in Canada, right? Which so completely nonconformist and has rejected America. So it's not as it seems then, the film, not nostalgia. The thesis then may be that this coming of age of this cohort, this final day of summer, saying goodbye to innocent childhood, is also the end of an era, end of the 50s, end of naivete about who we really are as a people, as a country, and that it's not as shiny as these beautiful automobiles. All right, so that's the thesis, and that's where Lucas is coming from, arguably. Okay, so, but is it good history? Well, let's take a look at that, and that's the rest of this lecture. What is this generation? Let's start there. What are they doing? How did it feel to live in these times? Okay, so baby boom. Okay, the film is high school kids in 1962. That means they're born right after the war, the early boomers. And you've heard this lecture before. This is that massive cohort that was not expected because up until this point in world history, industrialization meant urbanization, which meant smaller families. Urbanization always meant smaller families increasingly over time, and that was projected to continue. So not expected, and yet it happens. This is a time when 70 million children are born to a population of only 130 million Americans. Now, what really matters is one that the best educated, healthiest, most comfortable generation in the history of the world, and secondly, they're coming of age at a time when the U.S. is enormously affluent. In fact, coming out of World War II, 1945, the U.S. holds half the world's wealth, which has never happened before in the history of the modern world. The closest was England after Napoleonic Wars, where held maybe one-third of the world's wealth. And it's actually a problem because it's a trade problem. And in fact, that leads to the Marshall Plan, which is to resurrect Europe as a trading partner. But in any case, the U.S. is very well off at the end of the war. And so you have this generation who are being raised by parents, the so-called greatest generation, who have been through the Depression and World War II, and are motivated now to finally live the good life and give their children everything that they didn't have. Now, the fact that they can is not only because the economy is so conducive to it, it's also part of a macroeconomic plan. And that's often forgotten that the consumer economy post-World War II was planned and was subsidized from the federal government, both in Canada and the United States. And that gets to the fact that during the war, we have World War II is total war. The entire economy, the entire domestic economy is tailored to producing weaponry. Okay? And so obviously this is a huge concern because once the peace comes, what will happen to the economy? From a total war economy, you'll have a total collapse like you had after World War I, which was much less of a tailorization of the domestic economy to war production. Okay, so this unprecedented focus on war will bring an unprecedented depression is the expectation, right? And with that, we get this planning for what will happen in the peace. And the planning is, and a big part of that is to subsidize a consumer economy. And that's underwritten by federal investments in several ways. And one of them, if you're around in 2008, you remember the collapse of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and when everything went under. This is when the Federal National Mortgage Association is created through the Federal Housing Act, which is giving generous lower interest mortgages to returning veterans. There's also the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, 1944, the GI Bill. There's government loans to developers, and one of the biggest things is the underwriting of road and highway infrastructure at the state and federal level for suburbs. Okay, so in other words, the consumer culture is a subsidized culture, and it happens in a time and a place. Now, what's interesting is that there's other things as well that are planned for the post-war, and one of them, the direction that North America doesn't go as much, but Europe goes, is towards a welfare state economy, and that's how they plan for the post-war peace. And you especially see that in the UK, where they bring in 1945, the Labour government brings in the National Health Service and a whole panoply of social welfare policies, and nationalizes coal industry, nationalizes the railroad industry, and much more towards socialism. In North America, it's towards consumerism instead, and that's the answer to this fear of a post-war depression. In any case, you see this flight to the suburbs that is largely underwritten at the highest level, and post-war suburbs grow 8.5 times as fast as cities. And the key point is they are completely child-centered. In fact, the phenomenon is well studied by sociologists. And the number one reason that people give for moving here is for the kids. Okay, so what we get is a completely filiarchic culture where everything revolves around children. And especially when you look at those early ones, where this is what sociologists are interested in, why people are moving here when the houses are all the same, there's no individualization, there's no there's no privacy. There's no infrastructure like parks, stores, streetlights, libraries, especially the early ones. And partly academics have different answers for that, but partly I think largely it's rational choice. Cheap housing is available here with all the modern amenities for the first time, and you can have a big yard as well. Now, this matters a lot, and this matters even more in the post-war period because there's a widespread view at this time that suburban spaces are essential to a child's health and development. The American Public Health Association even said that big yards, 50 to 60-foot lots, were critical to a child's emotional well-being. Now, this is the Freudian era. And where you see real concerns about getting those first years right. And if you don't, your child could grow up to be a delinquent or a communist. Not even kidding. These are the views of the time. But yes, family life choices, including the mother's friends circle, and her entire life revolves around the children. One contemporary sociologist, S.D. Clark, said this: suburbia is a place where mother delivers the children once obstetrically and by car forever. Anyways, my point is the era of the driving mom in the suburbs has arrived, and it's still with us today. And a key point here, that the boomer generation is the first in the world history to see this as unexceptional, to see the family vehicle as normative, right? Every family has one, and more families in the suburbs have two. Now, this generation is also very sheltered because of this monoclass, monoracial upbringing. So unlike the cities that their parents grew up in, suburban children are raised in this classless world where housing is all in the same price range, right? Within a couple $100s of each other. The houses are almost identical, and in any given suburb there might be 4 different choices of floor plan. That's it. So this means that you don't get this exposure to the very rich. You don't get exposure to the poor. Okay. Now this kind of equality comes with some interesting effects, and one is that it creates real conformity. And that's because psychologists tell us that when everything is almost identical, it makes people very acute observers of small differences, right? And that is the essence of consumer society, right? You notice when the neighbors get that new vehicle. You notice when they get that new lawn set, whatever, right? So kids grow up having the same things as their friends, right? The same toys. They're watching the same television programs, and their parents conform to the same neighborhood social codes in dress, behavior, possessions, right? So the 50s, much like the 20s, is a time of mass conformity. And in essence, everything from television shows to child experts and juveniles, at this point, advertisers are cluing into this mass market of children, and they're targeting them directly in advertisements on what now everybody has, which is a television set. To child experts, parents, teachers, in the suburbs themselves, the message that kids grow up in this time is pretty simple, and it's this. It's that this society is designed for you. Now, paradoxically, or ironically, I guess, many of this generation and this over-sheltered and unprecedentedly pampered generation will turn against that, right? They'll turn it very quickly. Many of them will turn into drug-smoking hippies, or at least they will try that on, because those that are actually drug-smoking hippies or real truly rebels are always a minority. But later on, any case, many of them will give up on that to the extent that they embrace it and become rampant materialists by the 1980s. Okay, and they'll be jaded because they see the hypocrisy. Okay. They see the hypocrisy because they grow up in this bubble, and then they're awakened to that hypocrisy during the Vietnam War. So American Cold War diplomacy. This is a generation that is fed almost you could call it brainwashing about the communist world, the evils of communism, and there's some great scholarship on that, what it's like to grow up in the suburbs in this time and be prepared for war, right? And being told you're living in the greatest country in the world, we're the leaders of the free world, things that are easy to believe as a Boy Scout, right? America's keeping the world safe for democracy, and then you have this eye-opening experience where you learn later on that we've got these wars against peasants in Latin America, we've got this war on communists in Vietnam, which is really is not as simple as our government is telling us. Our government is lying to us, right? So the film is set in 1962, before the hippies, when Vietnam is just beginning, when youth rebellion is still innocent. And we know it will die hard, right? And the postscript tells us this, and that's the power of the film, because it's these last years of innocence of the generation raised on Davy Crockett. Okay, this picture, by the way, is Levittown. Levittown, Pennsylvania was the first of the major suburbs, and it was on Long Island, New York. 17,000 houses. They sold out within hours, and that was the beginning of suburban sprawl all over North America. One more slide on this topic, and this gets to what I'm talking about the consumerism and also the ideology of the 1950s and how they go hand in hand. And maybe you've heard of that, the kitchen debate, Nixon's kitchen debate. But basically, this is it, right? It's symbolic of so much, and this is where Vice President Nixon is touring the American, or is touring an exposition in Moscow, and in that exposition, there's an American exhibit, and it has the American kitchen. And what we get is this unscripted debate between Nixon and Khrushchev, which you can look online because you can find it there. And it's amazing, and it's about how Nixon defending American consumerism of having given everybody what they need, and so this we've created that perfect consumer society, which is liberating of women, by the way, because this is what they're talking about, and then you've got Khrushchev defending the Soviet experiment, specifically through gender, and saying that women, Soviet women, are emancipated, right? Emancipated to work all day and then come home and work for their husbands, but which is really what Soviet emancipation for women is, and who are drinking a goodly amount of vodka, which is actually basically what destroys the Soviet Union by the 80s. That half the population is addicted to vodka, and the state itself is addicted to vodka tax revenues, which becomes a bit of a conundrum for Gorbachev. Anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves, and that doesn't matter. But just know that that there is this ideological component to it. And this is a great symbol of the 50s here. Okay? And it's a time too when the U.S. and USSR are in this cultural battle for the hearts and minds of Europe, especially because there's a real fear that Europeans will go communist, right? And co-colonization, what cynics call this, but the spreading of American ideas and propaganda, even movies and books, through stuff like the Ford Foundation and other groups that sponsored American reading rooms in Europe. And on the other side of the wall, you got the Comintern trying to do the same thing, win hearts and minds in places like France and Germany, Italy, and Greece for the communist side. In any case, there is a cultural war at this time, okay? And consumerism plays a role in that. And the baby boom is this experiment, and so they're very closely watched, right? That it's very important that this generation gets all that they want. This society is completely designed for this generation. Okay, so that makes the coming of age that much more dramatic, right? It's such a shift. Historians have spilled a lot of ink here how this 50s worldview is just shattered by the horrors of Vietnam. This generation raised on Davy Crockett, right? And then finding out, it's not that, right? What a massive wake-up call that was, Vietnam, for this sheltered generation. In any case, the one last night before college, in the film, is also the end of an era, their end of innocence, their growing up, which mirrors the national story. So far, so good, George Lucas. You're doing a good job here on our bubble generation, the suburban generation, and what that's about, and how that and that coming of age at the end of it. True to history. Okay, so next thing worth looking at, how the film is all about cars, riding in cars, cruising. This is a major theme in the film, the major theme, that all the action is around driving. The social life of these teens is completely grounded in car culture. Everybody has a car or needs one. If you don't have a car, you're a nobody and you want one, because this is where courtship takes place, or this is where the action, this is more crudely, this is a way to get some action. And the film captures a really remarkable fact that we don't tend to recognize because we are accustomed to it, but I want to historicize it for you, and that is the complete motorization of North America, which in its day was a complete novelty. Okay, and California is where that begins, so appropriate that the film is set in Modesto. The restructuring of life around automobility, the universality of this phenomenon really deserves exploring and historicizing. And yeah, in this story, California is the global leader. In fact, that's true in the 20s already. In the 1920s, the San Fernando Valley, which is that valley north of Los Angeles. So if you've ever been up there in the Hollywood Hills, uh, at the Getty Museum there, if you think of what you've just come through, if you came out of Thousand Oaks on the other side of the hills, that is the San Fernando Valley. Okay, and it's this valley with Van Nuys, Universal City, North Hollywood, Thousand Oaks, all part of Los Angeles, but built out in the 1920s and 30s. And what made it important is this is the first American suburbs that are auto-dependent, okay, that are built on the assumption of vehicle ownership, not built around transit lines or streetcars as cities up to suburbs up to that point had been. Which means a few things, which means one, that by 1930, an amazing 93.7% of all housing in Los Angeles is single family homes, okay, which is the highest in the country, which also means the highest in the world. Uh, Chicago, it's 53%. Put another way, Los Angeles is majorly decentralized. It has 2,800 people per square mile. In New York, it's 23,000. So it's almost 1/10 the density of the older and eastern cities. Okay. Uh, and now this is a decentralization that every other city in North America will follow after the war. Which in a large measure is much to our chagrin today. But low density, because low density is brutal on the bottom line of public transit, and that's part of the story of why this collapses. Any case, it also means that Los Angeles is where we see what we'll get later everywhere else, which is decline of the core, the downtown, businesses leaving the central business district. What's happening is they're relocating. Oh, sorry, there's my the title for the slide, and the original Hollywood sign, by the way, said Hollywood Land, and but we get the relocating to the Strip. Okay, businesses leaving the central district, and this decentralization that happens beginning in LA in the 20s and then picking up in the post-war period in the 1950s, where it becomes the norm across North America. The relocation to the Strip. Okay, and that's where teens will cruise, and this too is a California innovation. The Strip begins in Los Angeles, Wilshire Boulevard being the famous first one, and that's where the commercial center is heading out here to the suburbs, where you have fast food, gas stations, car sale lots, motels, and critically you have parking in front, okay, as opposed to the old downtown core. So it's completely revolves around vehicles. Now, initially these are called taxpayer strips because businesses are looking for cheaper taxes outside of the core. And in some ways, these are placeholder architecture, which it's not super well built and not made to last. So here to get a tax break really, but soon seen as being very positive. Okay, and Wilshire Boulevard is called Miracle Mile because it's seen as this economic boon. Okay, these are not seen before the war, and they explode like wildfire, and pretty soon they're everywhere. And they're seen initially as a positive thing. I mean, sign of prosperity, which they were. But you know the upshot. This is where North American architecture is headed, and there's plenty of urban planners who have written volumes, spilled a lot of ink on the disaster that this became. But anyways, LA is a prototype of what is the mid-century metropolis. And if you want to know more on this, start with James Flink. He's a big author on motorization of North America. In any case, the 50s, we get this massive remaking of our landscape with the biggest infrastructure project in the history that the United States has ever had. Okay, the biggest infrastructure project in the United States happens in the 1950s as well, and maybe you know what I'm talking about, and that is the interstate highway system. Okay, the interstate highway system, and all 40,000 miles of it, all of it free, all of it paid for free, which means they're called free highways, but it means it's paid for by every taxpaying American. Now, the interstate system in the 1956 Highway Act under Eisenhower was a massive victory, and it gets back to what I'm talking about as a creation of the consumer culture. Massive victory for what's known as the highway lobby, capital HL. And this is Detroit automakers, it's the oil industry, it's developers, and it is the military. And the idea is if we can get all of America to head in the same direction as California, we'll get into this untapped market. This is where automakers, this is the motivation of automakers. And the untapped market of urban consumers, okay, and the idea is that if we open up cities and bring highways through them in a kind of a meat cleaver approach, we will get Americans into more vehicles, especially Americans that are in the older cities where cars are not really necessary. You have the density, the walkability, the transit, so you have market saturation there, right? Which is a key point. Since the 20s, the biggest manufacturing industry in America, the most jobs, the most important, is the automotive industry. And you cannot understate that. In fact, it is a big part of the reason the Allies won the war is the fact that America was a leader in automotive production. And this is where you have the capability, the capacity to create munitions on a mass scale. Okay, and in fact, World War II is the first time we see mass production of complicated weaponry, aviation, everything from planes to aircraft carriers, mass production of machinery with over 1 million parts, right? With over 1 million parts, which many of these aircraft did. Only the huge auto plants could handle that. Okay, and it also explains why the president of General Motors was head of industrial organization during the war years. And the old saying, which came from General Motors president, was that as goes General Motors, so goes America. What's good for General Motors is good for the country. In any case, to overcome saturation, cities had to be opened up, and this was something that automakers had wanted for a long time. Now, this is a picture of the diorama that General Motors had created in a pavilion in 1939 called Futurama, and you should look at the Google YouTube Futurama and see what visitors saw when they visited Motorama, the city of the future, America of the future in 20 years, what it would look like by 1960, completely motorized, okay? Complete ease of access, and a great quote there by Bel Geddes, who designed it. There would be no more reason for motorists who's passing through a city to slow down than there is for an airplane passing over. This is the vision, right? But again, it is about profit. Now, California is proof that a lot more can be done in creating motorization and getting a car or two or three into every family and every youth in America. Okay? LA in 1949 has 1 car for every 2.5 people. Now, that's a number that most European countries will not get into till the 1980s, and some still haven't. Okay, New York at that point is 1 for every 8.7. Okay, so if you took the LA numbers to the top 95 cities in America, that would have been another 8.2 million cars. And of course, Detroit is fully aware of that, right? Urban freeways then can make that happen. So spending money on roads and making vehicles the common sense choice and connecting those suburbs to easy moving freeways is exactly what you want, okay? So, and making highways faster than trains. And this will encourage dispersal, it will encourage consumers, it will sell more cars. So 1956 is a big victory for Detroit. They get their highways, it's taxpayer money, it's not toll highways. That's barely considered. And yeah, massive impact, social, economic, and really just seen back then as a very positive thing. This is positive. This is progress. This is all good. Now, it needs to be said that this is the culmination of a vision that goes back to the 19th century, and of course, it makes sense that transport is the lifeblood of a nation, and and so back already in the 1890s, we have farmers pushing for better roads. We get the better roads movement that's also pushed actually by the cycling manufacturers who want a better highway system so to sell bicycles in the 1890s during the bicycle craze. But this is, and we have the military. The military is always pushing for better roads so that it can move its equipment around the country in response to the unlikely event of an invasion of America, right? Which isn't so unlikely in World War II. In any case, it's an old movement, but not like this. Okay? The 1950s is where it finally comes to this apotheosis where the highway lobby wins really big. And what's really interesting too about this, and this is consistent when you study American history, is that federal spending. Americans believe in small government. They tend to, and the Republican Party certainly lands on that side. And yet here is something that was immensely beneficial to spurring this economy in the post-war period. But massive government intervention in the billions by Republican administration. Okay, and changes everything. Okay, as I said, and especially with youth. And that starts with courtship, which is very well documented by historians. Kids with cars means dating habits go through a revolution. Till motorization, courtship is on the porch, or it's in the house of the girl being courted under the watchful eyes of the parent. If you want to read more on this, get Paul Carter. From front porch to backseat, courtship in 20th century America. And what he gets at is like I said, this well-studied phenomenon that the car changes everything. It makes courtship the man's domain, or the boys, as I should say, and it means that women are now at their mercy for better or for worse, right? Now, initially, you can't really make love in vehicles, and all vehicles initially are convertible. The closed cab comes in the later 1920s, and Ford built his cab specifically in the Model T to discourage lovemaking. Not even kidding, and that's a fact. But by the 1930s, most cars are closed, and the rumble seat is an early favorite for lovemaking, and so are these closed models with these fold down front seats, and a lot more white weddings follow from that. Now, as I said, this is a well-studied thing, and it's if you want more on that, a longitudinal study, which is fascinating, of American culture, is done by Robert and Helen Lind. If you haven't heard of it, it's super interesting. It goes from the 1890s to the 19 to the I think early 30s, but in any case, and they document the changes that happen in American culture using the Muncie, Indiana, as a case study of that. And one thing that they find is exactly this, what Paul Carter talks about in his book later. And what they also point out is that the crackdown, the Vice Squad cracking down on brothels in Muncie during World War I and in the 1920s pushes prostitution into vehicles. So we're starting to see that already, and there's lots more evidence that that happens as well. But for youth, it's absolutely a revolution, and away from the prying eyes of parents, and largely it's the male taking over, because he's invariably the owner of the vehicle, and the sexualization of vehicles too from auto manufacturers is very early, and in some ways it's pretty shocking. What back in the 1920s, what passed muster for advertising that way, and the suggestive ads that we had coming or in that direction. The one place in the 1950s where this is, well, there's a couple places where this courtship happens, but the main one, and where out and out sex is happening, is in the drive-in theaters, which are known as, they start out in the 30s as these family places. 1933 is the first drive-in theater in America. By the 1950s, they're at their peak, and now there's over 4,000. But they quickly become known as passion pits. They peak in 1958. And the place you hook up is at the drive-in, as depicted in the film. And the film has Mel's Drive-In, which was a drive-in in California. It actually still exists. It begins in 1949. Two Jewish guys in San Francisco that set up this drive-in chain. Okay, so and the drive-in is another big part of the motorization of America and the change in habits. And specific to courtship, it's big. This is where you meet on cruise nights, on Friday night cruise at the drive-in. And this goes back to the 20s as well, and it begins actually in Texas with Royce Haley's Pig Stand, which opens in 1921. And it and I like talking about them because pulled pork sandwiches is what's on the menu here, and soft drinks. But also on tap is Budweiser. Okay, drinking and driving, not a problem. And it becomes a chain. It becomes the first chain with out-of-state independent franchises. A&W follows that in 1924, and they introduce these young skirted tray girls, which is part of the attraction of cruising. But it's really in the post-war as motorization explodes and as youth get into vehicles that these take off. And yeah, in the movie it smells driving. As I said, this was started in San Francisco in 1947, right after the war, by Mel Weiss and Harold Dobbs. And the apex of the drive-in is exactly when our film is set. In the early 1960s. At that point, there's over 30,000 of them nationwide. And the drive-in is the central meeting point in courtship. The central ritual is cruising. The central meeting point is the drive-in. And Friday night street cruising is exploding in the 1950s as the first boomers get their licenses. Now, this is this is kind of a modern iteration. I was just thinking about this when I was prepping this lecture. The modern iteration, really what people have always done. They think of promenading in the Victorian era, and some movies show that well, how promenading in the Central Park of London or wherever, you would walk the park with a chaperone, and ladies would accept calling cards from gentlemen. This was a ritual, and really it's the same idea. You get attention, you try and hook up. And cruising really explodes as the first of these boomer generation are reaching high school age. Most famous and first real cruising strips, well, the first is Van Nuys Boulevard in the San Fernando Valley, and I already told you about that area. Detroit's Woodward Avenue, though, is an early hotspot too. And Detroit is up there with California in terms of early motorization. This is where you have the first traffic light in the U.S. This is where you have the first traffic cops. And that makes sense because there's Detroit auto workers get cars for cheap, so Detroit is motorized early on. But Woodward Avenue, I mention that because it's still a big part of car history in the States, and they have an annual show and shine where they get about 1 million people out for that every year. So Cruise Night continues. It's become a very different thing. It's largely for older car buffs now, and it is now a family event. But at that time in the 50s, advertisers know youth are doing this. So in towns such as Modesto, and exactly in Modesto, you have on-location DJ broadcasting directly from a diner on the Strip. In this case, it was Burge's Drive-In in Modesto, and so you have while the Friday night cruise is happening, you've got this live broadcast from the diner where all the action is, and advertising that's aimed at these Friday night youth cruising around with money to spend. Now, this ritual begets, I should say, a predictable blowback from the older generation, who's concerned about everything with youth at this time. But one thing they're concerned about is traffic, and the authorities are not happy with what they're seeing that way. But there's a racial element to here too, because Latinos with their low-riding cars is what you see in California. It's a big part of the cruise night phenomenon. So what you get is these anti-cruising rules that are showing up, and you still see those in some cities. Yeah, and you definitely see them in Modesto and in California cities where there's restrictions on how many times a car may pass a certain point on a street within a given time frame. So these bylaws are still around today. But yeah, that blowback begins already in the 50s. Now, meeting up at cruise night would often also end in the inevitable street race, the Friday night street race. And the film also has that. And the night of his day is the killer hot rodder. And in the film, this is John Milner, the drag racing king, and with his 1932 Ford Deuce Coupe. So he's got the fastest car in the valley, and that coupe is perfectly cast in the movie because the 32 Ford is the quintessential hot rod icon. This is the vehicle where Ford brought affordable V8 performance to millions of people, and he sold millions of these. By 1962, it's already enjoyed decades of being the car of choice for hot rod racing. Now, this goes back to, and this is really fascinating to me, it goes back to a few guys from Hollywood High School, and notably Doane Spencer, who buys this old Ford Roadster from his friend for $45, and then he modifies it. So it's a stripped down 32 Ford Roadster modifications that allowed him to quadruple the factory horsepower in it. So he's not the first to modify this way. And there we've got another legendary customizer, Jimmy Summers, right, in his 24 Model T. So this is done with other vehicles, but the 32 Deuce Coupe really catches on, in the whole Deuce Coupe series that followed in other years. And what happens is Spencer wins a bunch of show and shine prizes for best appearing car, and starts winning races, and this becomes the hot rod of choice. Now, the popular perception of hot rodders in the 40s, 50s, early 60s is they're a threat to the social order. And Hollywood depicts them as beatniks and bikers and as violent drug users in these exploitive movies. In reality, they're primarily car enthusiasts. They're mechanics like Doane Spencer and like our film's John Milner. And they'd race outside of town, street racing. But early on, there's a realization this is dangerous, and clearly it was for Milner, who crashes, sees his car explode, right, and lives through that. But that kind of thing is enough of a concern, and it happens frequently enough that what happens in the 50s is municipalities are organizing street connas or rodeos, which are organized street racing. Serious hot riding racing, meanwhile, is also happening organically, and that goes back to the 30s with the Hot Rod Association. The Southern California Timing Association forms in 1937, and they start organizing races in the Salt Flats and Mojave Desert, which is about an hour north of Los Angeles. And then their rules get picked up after the war in 1955 by the National Hot Rod Association that forms in 1955. This is the same era that in the South dirt track stock car racing is becoming popular there. Basically, what you want to get here is that a real sport is evolving for what were unplanned and organic races that begin with youth, and these hot rodding events take hold across North America after the war. There's a real fascinating history too here of how Detroit picks up on this and gets behind stock car racing as a means of promotion, of brand allegiance by sponsoring drivers, and you see that especially in NASCAR. And you also get these weird rules of homologation where in order to be stock, homologation, yeah, a word used pretty much every day, in order to be stock, a car has to also be produced for general retail sales. So the big three would make these very limited series of uber powerful race cars in order to be able to qualify these in pro racing. Not super important, but what matters is hot rodding is a real cultural phenomena in this time, and it's in the film, and Milner is someone who, he's a stock character of the 50s with a well cast vehicle. He survives the dangerous racing in the film, not to go into the pro circuit, but to be killed by a drunk driver, ironically, right? And again, maybe this is George Lucas's social commentary here. So yes to the 32 Deuce Coupe, yes to the hot rod racing, the street racing, the dangers, the excitement, and the whole this whole subculture. But how about all these other cars? And yes, it goes without saying, cars are a principal character in the film, as they were at the time. Your car is an extension of yourself, your image. The bigger engine, the more cream, the better. The more chrome, the better. Steve's 58 Impala takes pride of place, and it's a beauty there on the top, right? That's Ron Howard, right? Bob Falfa, Harrison Ford, as you probably noticed in the film, 1955 Chevy, another beauty, and then the Pharaohs, they have this massive 51 Mercury, just a boat. So this is the height of the big post-war garage stretchers with amazing designs, which are works of art. Really, they're overpowered, they're overstyled, they're super unsafe, and they're exactly what most people want. And these vehicles are worth talking about, and academics tend to in a variety of ways, discussing what they reflect, and they reflect quite a lot. Along with commodity fetishism. And one of the things is the wide open spaces of North America and the fact that with sprawl, people are driving way more here. So they want comfort first. Okay? And that's very different than Europe. And more than that, it's post-war affluence. And it's a post-war generation that wants solid, big muscle cars that resemble the tanks and aircraft that they fought with in Europe, really. And that's another theme. And finally, it's also about selling people more than they need. Okay, and as I said, academics have done a lot of work on this kind of thing and what it is about these post-war designs that reflect this era. And this gets at that intentional advertising to the greatest, to these veterans after World War II about, here's your chance to get back behind the wheel, or behind the flight controls of what you were doing over there in Europe. Okay, and some people pathologize it, and you can get that from Dr. Strangelove's America by Margot Henriksen, that it's about security and nuclear fears, this kind of thing. And others see it as rational choice theory, that this is just what people want, and now they have the opportunity to do it. And the bigger the machine, the better. Paul Boyer is more along the pathologizing side of that as well. So, but yes, lots has been done. Many PhDs have gone over to the post-war dream machines and what these mean about the culture. Now, coming out of the war, everybody is infatuated with the jet plane, which is a wartime invention. And the Lockheed Fighter is the first to be built in America, then a seeker plane. Harley Earl, who is the chief designer, already famous by the 1930s for a pretty amazing car he created called the Buick Y-Job. You have to check that one out. But in any case, he gets a pass to tour the facility in Burbank, California, where these planes are being produced. And the idea is because they want to incorporate the designs here into their post-war automobiles, and this really deliberate effort to capture these veterans when they come home. And again, coming out of that place of fear where there may be an economic crash afterwards, we have to encourage consumption in the post-war period. We were building weapons during the war. Look for our post-war dream machines. And this is where we get the start of the fin war, because the fins of the Lightning show up as part of the taillight assembly for the 1949 Cadillac. Now, a symbol of the times is the fact that Harley Earl becomes head of the design facility in this $125 million new design facility in suburban Detroit, and a massive increase in staff from 200 in the wartime to 1,200 workers by 1956. And this is a great symbol of a triumph of design over engineering and where the focus is going in automobile production in this period of time. 1951, Harley Earl introduces the LeSabre, which is named after the U.S. Jet Interceptor. Very low, only 50 inches in height, wraparound windshield inspired by the jet, curved glass that famously distorts the driver's vision, but then everybody does this anyway. And the front grille literally is a jet intake, the back is a jet engine exhaust, and the rear fenders have these jet stabilizers. Now, the design, and what you see there in the top image is the concept car. Okay, so concept cars is what would go into limited production, and they'd be shown at the Motoramas and Autoramas, which I'll mention in a sec. But then you get the production car that comes out of that. But it's a way of whetting people's appetites and saying, look for these dream machines in the future. But yeah, in 1949, Detroit starts this annual car show called Motorama, where new cars, sorry, it's first called Autorama, and then later it's called Motorama, and these would happen every fall. New cars are unveiled, much like new iPhones to tech nerds today, but the cars would be on these rotating platforms for the big reveal, always with women showing them off, and then the big three would show their concept cars here as well, the dream machines of the future. And you get some amazing thing, these Jetsons kind of cars. My favorite being the 1959 Cadillac Cyclone, which is there's a series of these being made. Massive fins, the bubble top. It's got portholes in the door that you can put your hand through if you happen to be on a toll highway or have to do anything, which are very rare. There's a couple of them back east, but it's also amazingly, it's got a radar system built in those front cones, so it's got an early collision avoidance detection system. It's incredible the technology that they had available already that was incorporated into these things. On the bottom left there, you've got the GM Firebird, which is this dream concept car, which would come out as a Firebird years later. Not quite look like that, but there's still a few around, and there are a bunch of Cyclones. I don't know if I said the 1960 got a finectomy, and it had a much lowered fin there on the Cadillac. It looks pretty great. But yeah, something not too different would come out in production shortly after, and that was the idea: whet the appetite for these crazy, beautiful machines. Now, at the same time, you've got the horsepower race, and then in the post-war, the V8 engine design called the Kettering engine becomes the standard. Now, V8s have been around for about 30 years, but the Kettering engine has compression that gives a lot more horsepower, and it's meant to run on high octane. And the big three automakers all start putting out bigger and bigger V8s. They're in competition here for the most powerful vehicles, fleet average power, and engines are going up to 400 horsepower, and they're also huge. Engines are measured in displacement in the early 50s and low 300s in inches, and that's pushing 400 by the 60s. And the ultimate is the GM 501, which is in Cadillacs and Oldsmobiles. Its fact was probably even higher than that. But in any case, these engines have to be, because by this point, these cars can be 21 feet long. Okay, so and all intentional, more power, more comfort. Now the problem being, of course, so in short, the cars in this time period are beautiful. They're crazy. They're getting more amazing and out there every year. Styling is completely taking over from function. And some note that early, this Methodist bishop says, "Who are the madmen who build cars so long they cannot be parked, and are hard to turn at corners, vehicles with hideous tail fins full of gadgets and covered in chrome, so low that an average human being has to crawl in the door, so powerful that no man dare use the horsepower available?" And the answer, of course, is that the madmen are these manufacturers that need to keep selling, and in affluent America, that and this gets at something which needs saying, that mass production has meant a problem of surplus. And in fact, it was the auto industry that first woke up to this, because Ford was the first to get into mass production of consumer durables. Okay, and getting the price down so low that everybody in America could afford a Model T. So he's the first to find out that this doesn't mean everyone just gets what they want. It also means that you need to encourage more consumption, because mass production requires mass consumption, because you get a saturation point. And how do you sell to someone something they already have? Ford didn't have an answer for that, which is why he lost out to General Motors, Alfred P. Sloan. And before the war, what he figured out, and this is called, the revolution is called Sloanism, which is annual style changes, right? And doing exactly what we're seeing here, built-in obsolescence, right? Style over substance. And changing that style chronically, continually, right? But what happens then, of course, is styling comes at the expense of safety, and perhaps you know that, right? You've heard this story, that safety features that are becoming common even in Europe, and that used to be also in American cars, and also these same American producers are producing different cars for the European market that are safer and not so insane. But they're not happening now, right? In America, style dictates low, but with that suspension and weight, for that low profile, you should have radial tires, but Detroit cheaps out and uses bias ply, which they get away with in America. Soft seats means no road feel. Critics call it the marshmallow feel. You don't really feel the road. And the problem with these 3-ton vehicles is they're completely under-equipped in the braking department. Good example is in 1967 Cadillac. It took 386 feet for that vehicle to come to a complete stop if it was going 80 miles an hour, which is more than a football field, right? And here you see that the Chrysler Imperial in 1958, which is designed by Virgil Exner, the big designer at Chrysler, 6,000 pounds curb weight, right? This is no grocery getter. And the average American that is driving these are generally women at home who are getting groceries, and they absolutely don't need that, right? But yeah, excessive front and rear overhang also impacts handling. The wraparound windshield obstructs the views. And in accidents, the dash and the steering wheel are killers, right? And there's no internal protection or seat belts. But disposability is the ethic here. So very different than other motorized nations where the per capita income is much lower in this period. Uh, Even in the wealthiest nations in Europe, like England and Germany, they're way behind America, and Japan is again way further down that pole. But in these places, a car is rare, it's expensive, it's meant to last a long time, but not so here. This is a disposability ethic. And you know what? American youth are the beneficiaries of this because they can buy that Thunderbird or that Pontiac Tempest for only $2,000 or 2186, as you see here from the 1962 Tempest ad. American youth again are the beneficiaries of this. They can get a brand new car if they want, not super safe, but very powerful. Or they can wait a couple years. They could, like the '58 Impala that Steve has. We find out when his friend ends up at a car lot and a used car salesman comes out and says, "I'll give you $1,000 for that." That's pretty generous because the thing about annual styling changes and an emphasis on style over anything else is these cars are dated as soon as the next model run comes out the following year, and their value plummets very fast. In fact, you probably know this, that with new cars of the era, when you left the lot, you lost 30% of your value right away. It's a used car already. Right, so the used car market is massive, and it is a blessing for these youth that can get into vehicles for as low as $500, a very nice car. Now you compare that to what happens in Europe, and so you can get cars as powerful as a Ferrari, but Italian teens, one, they're not making nearly as much, and secondly, those cars are not affordable. They're way out of their price range. So they can ogle these little well-built Italian roadsters that Ferrari is putting out, but that's it. And they're not appreciably different in terms of power. Okay, so the Tempest is a good example. 2 years later, John DeLorean turns it into the GTO, and he beefs it up by throwing in a massive 389 big block engine that gets over 300 horsepower, okay, which is crazy in a car that doesn't handle very well. Okay, but again, on the American straight highways, not as big of a deal as a curvy Italian road, but but at the same time, GM, those same engines are going into Ferraris in Italy, but they're way out of reach of the average youth. Okay, so that is something that the film nails, the motorization of American youth at this time, right, and what that looks like. Now, in this story of the Dream Machine era, Edsel is always seen as the low point, the wake-up call and partly that's because there was huge buildup for the Edsel, and it bombs in sales. And it seems to be, as it goes down as a symbol of decadence, a symbol of an industry in decline, an industry that is content to get profit from big vehicles, and you always get more profit from larger vehicles with more options, and there's a lot made on options, and again, producing, like, safety doesn't sell, actually, is what manufacturers found out, beginning with Ford when they put a lifeguard safety package in their cars in the mid-50s and nobody bought it. Okay, and government is not forcing them down that road. But in any case, it's just the Edsel becomes the symbol that you've got an industry that is out of control, and and can't think of anything new, right? How many ways can you restyle a car? So what they've done here is they put what looks like a horse collar on the grill, and it's seen universally is seen as pretty ugly. And in any case, the sales of the 58 Edsel tank, right? The Edsel is a bit of a bomb, to say the least, and becomes this lasting symbol of the industry itself. In any case, and in the film, Kurt's sister, Lori, Steve's girlfriend, owns an Edsel, right? And so maybe this is Lucas reminding us that what is about to change, and things are about to change radically. Maybe he's reminding us here that the dream machines have clay feet, because as soon as we see an Edsel, we recognize that, right? And this is all about to come crashing down. This whole the industry is about to have a real rough reality check, and that begins a couple years later when Ralph Nader puts out this book, Unsafe at Any Speed, and he aims directly at the jugular of the auto industry about their designed-in dangers, and that these are unsafe gas guzzlers that are killing people unnecessarily, and that these same manufacturers know how to make better cars, and that they need to be forced to do that, right? And this is what leads to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. It leads to all sorts of regulation on the industry, where they're forced to bring in changes, and also fuel efficiency standards. We get industry CAFE standards, which is corporate average fuel economy standards, being brought in shortly after that as well. Now, Detroit is not ready for that because it's been resting on its laurels for a long time, and what happens is the imports are taking over and really gutting the industry, gutting Detroit, right? So we get massive unemployment in the auto industry. The sector takes a kicking through import sales because the Europeans, but especially the Japanese, have been building safe cars cheaply and fuel efficient. So after the energy crisis, this is where Americans are putting their dollars. And you see that import market go from a tiny fraction in the early 60s up to almost 35 to heading north of 35% by the 1980s. So a huge hit. General Motors, in fact, is displaced by Tokyo, or by Japan replaces America as the #1 producer of automobiles in the 1990s for a little while, or maybe it was the 80s. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. The point is, they're about to. There's a big change coming. Okay, and again, here the film is right there on the edge in the last years of this, the glory days of the dream machines before the reality check happens. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is music, and the film's musical score is amazing, and the music really is setting the time. Okay, and rock and roll, rockabilly music is what Lucas is giving us here. Now, and the film is so successful in doing that, it became a vehicle for album sales, which is sales. And as I said, in the 70s, we were all buying this double album set with the 41 hits from American Graffiti. Now, this had not been anticipated at all. And in fact, Paramount had not got did not secure the rights for the films for the songs until later, when it realized that the film that was creating a renaissance in the 50s music secured the rights then, and then put out the album, but had to pay dearly for them because of that. But in any case, had not been foreseen, and certainly was something that was that other filmmakers then try and replicate by intentionally giving amazing soundtracks in their films, in order to, if you bomb at the box office, at least it's a vehicle for sales in that area in vinyl. But yeah, the score is amazing, and it's perfect, right? Because it is that time. Rock and roll is still very young in 1962. It's the pre-Beatles era, and mostly what's around then is what's known as rockabilly, and that has there's a good component of rockabilly musicians on the album, including Bill Haley here. Rockabilly, actually, as it happens, originated in Modesto, California, which is where the film is set, by which I mean this is where rockabilly first hits the radio, and that is the story of the Maddox Brothers and Rose. And this is a group from I think it was Tennessee. They or maybe it's Oklahoma. Anyway, they go out on the road to California, and they end up on the radio here in 1937 in Modesto, and they would become nationally popular because their unique hillbilly sound, as it was called. And this is the foundation of rockabilly. And they didn't call it that, as Rose Maddox said. People just called us hillbilly or country boogie. There was no rock and roll, obviously. And then eventually it's called rockabilly. And initially, or what it is at that point is a blending of Western country music with African American rhythm and blues, and picked up by Elvis and picked up by other big names like Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, who are all on the album as well. But yeah, Bill Haley, Rock Around the Clock, classic rockabilly, the kind of music white kids made their parents nervous about because it's seen as black music. Needless to say, the cult of youth coalesces around rock. Okay, and the key years in rock music are 1954 to 1950 to 1957. Elvis famously appears on Ed Sullivan in 1957 three times. In that same year, this Philadelphia television show that's been going for a few years called American Bandstand with Dick Clark goes national. And rockabilly is now becoming rock and roll. And there's a big reaction to this on the part of parents' generation. There's even a few record burnings. Elvis is seen as overtly sexual and with his gyrating, and you've heard this. So there's even something called an Elvis Suppressly organization, which is awesome. In spite of the fact that this is innocent stuff, but it's coming out of fear that of this devil's music and its association with sex, for one. And in fact, Ed Sullivan said he'd never have Elvis on because of his obscenities, his obscene gyrating. And then when he appeared on Milton Berle, he decided he had to have him. It's also a reaction to this working class greaser subculture, okay, which is important. And there is a greaser subculture that exists, and it is seen as threatening. And it's in the film as well, where Kurt is the Pharaohs, right? Kurt is forced by the Pharaohs to help rip the axle out of a cop car, which is classic antics of these greaser gangs that do exist. And this is a subculture that's all about their cars and racing and trouble. And they're everywhere. They seem to be suddenly everywhere in the 1950s and early 60s. Back in the East, they tend to be largely Italian and Puerto Rican, and in the West, largely Hispanic. So they've got that ethnic working class component to it, which is threatening to white bread middle suburban America for sure. And they get in enough trouble. There's enough reality to it that it is threatening, right? Of course, these car cultures and their gangs don't go away, especially in California. In fact, Modesto today has one of the highest gang affiliations in the United States, and is the current car theft capital of the states, and has been for the past few years. So things haven't changed on that front, and we're still obviously there's something empirical to that threat. Enough of that that parents are very very afraid. But just in general, they're the reaction to rock and the excitement over it really has to be understood in the cultural context. That parents see these misbehaving, out of control youths at a time when conformity is the norm, right? And when even jeans are a rebellion statement, okay? And that's important to know that dress codes, jeans are prohibited wear in high schools across the country, and even at the university level. Stanford University in the 1950s, you are not allowed to wear, men or actually neither gender is allowed to wear denim. Or t-shirts. T-shirt is not acceptable wear, as you see there in a school dress code. Schools also enforced hair codes, right? Boys' hair had to be cut above the ears. Anything longer is completely inappropriate. So what this really is here's this music that's directed at youth, that's vaguely threatening. It's exciting. And here you have youth working out their identities separate from their parents in this smothering, contained suburban bubble, which really at its core was about these youth and giving them the perfect child and setting them up. So these expectations are really pivotal for appreciating the overreaction, the panic over delinquency, and we definitely have that. Most famous symbolic of that is the 1955 juvenile delinquency film, the Blackboard Jungle. which which features a scene of a shocking scene where the kids are smashing their parents' records. And if you've seen Rebel Without a Cause too, you know that it's more like Rebel Without a Clue. There's really no rebellion happening here, but this is how parents are reading it. Okay. So, you know, and then Wolfman Jack, and there's a spate of these type of films. It's a whole genre of juvenile delinquency films. Wolfman Jack doesn't help things, and his story is hilarious. And he's not in Modesto in 1962, but as we know, there is live broadcasting from the Strip on Friday nights. But he's in Louisiana and then later San Diego, and he's already famous by 1962 for his signal wolf howl. In fact, he's nationally famous because, and this is awesome, he got a job for a station in Mexico that's set up by a genius named Ramon Vasquez. And this is the first of the so-called border blaster stations. Now, what that means is the FCC controls in the states how big a station could be and to prevent cross signals, and it's also very expensive in the States to have a license. So Vasquez sets up right across the border in Mexico so he can blast out as big as he wants. So the limit in the States was 50,000 watts. That's the biggest radio station you can have. And Vasquez sets up a 250,000 watt station. So you can hear Wolfman Jack. This is how he becomes nationally famous and really does a lot to promote rock music. In this evening program, which is kind of like what SNL does for television later, and he's hilarious. He's if parents are listening, yeah, they're shocked and abhorred. He says things like "get naked" and or you know, reach, put your hands on the radio and squeeze my knobs, things like this. So off color and everywhere, right? So you could hear Wolfman Jack from the border down, you know, from New York to from New York to Los Angeles, all the way from the Mexican border up to the Northwest Territories. He is everywhere. Racy late night programming. In any case, so and Wolfman makes a personal appearance here on the film, as you know. Okay, now what's interesting about this is this response to what some call the devil's music, and some musicians even feeling that they are playing the devil's music because the culture is telling them this. A lot of this music is actually coming right out of the evangelical movement, and some of these biggest rockabilly and rock stars came out of the Pentecostal churches. So Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, Johnny Cash, James Brown, B.B. King, all grew up in Pentecostal churches, and Elvis is a great example of that. He's a lot of his music is gospel music. He usually has a backup a choir, gospel choir, right? He warms up by listening to gospel music. It's very important to him. His faith is very important to him. So this idea of rebellion really is a misread on this generation and what is happening here in rock music. If you want to know more about that, read this book a couple of years ago. It came up by Randall Stevens, The Devil's Music: How Christians Inspired, Condemned, and Embraced Rock and Roll. In any case, yes, the music is massively important for the time for this generation and appropriate in the film, and Lucas does a great job. And by the way, like any style tribe, the greasers get commodified and normalized, and largely that is through American Bandstand, 1957. As I said, it goes national with Dick Clark, and it starts to feature greasers, and that's how this goes mainstream. Okay, in any case, that's the story and the glory. Music, another great theme in the film, and why it really works. Okay, I hope that was all good for you. And yeah, is it pure nostalgia? No, I don't think so. I think there's some pretty powerful stuff here, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I hope it was good for you. I hope the course was too. This is it. This is the last one. All right, any questions, let me know. Thanks for listening.